Hello and welcome to Celebrating Cinema, a podcast for the love of cinema. I'm your host, Laura Gommans, and today on this episode, we're launching an ongoing series called Sign of the Times. It's a new event series from Hugo Emmerzael and Dan Hassler-Forrest. It's 21st century cinema and a live conversation. Arthouse, pulp, the weird stuff that somehow became canon, the films we're still fighting about. Screened with curated clips, an extended introduction, a discussion afterwards, and of course, room for questions from you guys. Every month, Hugo and Dan pick a subject and record a Celebrating Cinema episode about it, and then continue the discussion live in the room with all of you after seeing the movie. And we're starting where the century actually started. For this episode, 25 years ago, The Fast and the Furious was a small movie about Los Angeles street racers, immigrant car culture, and a cop who kind of didn't want to be one. Fast forward to now. The same franchise is a $7 billion engine where Vin Diesel and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson have spent a decade publicly feuding. Cars getting launched into outer space, and the concept of quote-unquote family is now a marketing strategy. What does the arc of The Fast and the Furious, going from basically Echo Park to outer space, say about the state of American cinema? Just a quick introduction, Dan Hassler-Forrest is a media studies professor at Utrecht University whose work reads pop culture through a political lens. Superheroes, transmedia franchises, and the politics of fantasy. He's best known for the 2019 Washington Post essay arguing that The Lion King is a fascist story. It went super viral and you've probably read it. The Fast and the Furious screens at Lab 111 on June 17th. Dan and Hugo will discuss, and you can be there, of course. The link is in the show notes.
So I'm joined today by friend, colleague of Filmkrant, academic and writer of the new book Fast and Furious Franchising, Dan Hassler-Forrest. Welcome to Celebrating Cinema.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
To all our guests, I ask the same question, which is, can you maybe talk a bit about a formative childhood memory that instilled the great love of cinema that you have still till this very day?
I can. And I swear I did not plan it this way, but my dad took me to see The Empire Strikes Back.
Hey, and what are you wearing?
I know, I did not, like, it's a pure coincidence because I did not know that we were going to even talk about this, but he took me to see that while we were on vacation in Ireland, and I cannot have been older than 6. I had not seen the first Star Wars, so I was thrown into, the second part of this big epic space saga, and it just blew my mind. And, it's crazy because it's this big movie with aliens and laser guns and all this stuff, and then it ends with the heroes being defeated. And
Quite a downer.
yeah, this is weird and non-ending. Han is frozen in carbonite. Luke's hand has been chopped off. The villains have won. And I think that, and then the sort of having all of the comic books and the toys and stuff to remind you of the experience and the picture books and things, that's probably the most formative event that set up my appreciation for cinema. So, because still to this day, I can put on one of the grindhouse versions of The Empire Strikes Back, but what that looks like an actual movie, from 1980, and still be like, holy shit, this is the biggest pulp movie ever made,
Yes.
with cliffhangers, but also so much craftsmanship. And it's it's like a pulp opera. We could talk about Empire Strikes Back all day long.
I'll just immediately throw in one aside that then generationally this is a very good fitting because when I was 6, I watched The Phantom Menace in the
There you
cinema
go.
in
Yeah.
1999.
Yeah.
So it's like the passing of the baton, also a
There you go.
completely different era of Hollywood, which is exactly what we're going to talk about. I mean, today we were talking about the new book that is being published, the Fast and Furious franchise.
Yeah.
I wanted to briefly, before we get into these films, discuss something that's, I think, very important to both of us.
Yeah.
And I see it very much in your work as an academic, but also we are colleagues at the same publication, Filmkrant.
Yes, for sure.
Is the ability to speak and to write about any kind of film. And then I'm talking mainstream blockbuster fare, extreme slop, basically flood our streaming services and whatnot, but also, of course, very artistic and experimental cinema. I feel like we always have this middle ground where all of these things in its intersection are very interesting to spectate.
Yeah.
Can you briefly maybe contextualize how that, let's say, ceaseless interest or this, let's say, very broad perspective on film also fed your academic career and how that kind of, shaped the work that you do?
Yeah, it's absolutely. I grew up with Hollywood movies mostly, right? Especially like old Hollywood movies that my dad used to tape from television and keep them on video cassette on Betamax. He had an old Betamax player. So I watch everything from like The Court Jester, Modern Times, sort of more modern versions of the classic Hollywood movie like The Princess Bride and stuff like that. And as a teenager, I started getting into more art house type stuff. Like, my local art house theater would play like Hitchcock classics and Jim Jarmusch movies. So those were the things in the 1980s that sort of fit. And I would read Filmkrant at the time. So I just read everything voraciously that was about film and had like from longer ago than I can even remember, just had this obsessive interest in anything that was related to film. So to me, and I think this is something that we obviously have in common, but that to me defines what I'd probably pretentiously call like true cinephilia, right? It's like that cinema is not defined by its artistic quality, right? Or maybe its artistic cult, because that's sometimes what it is, but by its power to create dreamlike worlds. And that's just not something that is limited to the things that people also associate with art, right? So for me, like last night, I watched 2 movies. I watched Long Day's Journey into Night, which I made sure that my 3D glasses were charged and everything, and I just sort of turned down all the lights and gave myself over to this insane Chinese film noir, Lynch-inspired dream world. And then I took 20 minutes to like sort of let it sink in. And then I watched Jackass the movie, which also is cinema, right?
To be honest, experimental cinema masterpiece.
100%, 100%. I hadn't seen it in years, and I was like, my God, when this was made, this was the future of cinema. This is the TikTok world that we've ended up in, but done in a perfectly balanced way that uses staging and mise-en-scène and, humanity as its main components. And so that felt like such a fulfilling evening because it felt like it was, on the one hand, like a true spectrum of cinema, but also at no point in the evening did I feel like one of those was in some way inherently superior to the other. There were just 2 ways of being creative with cinema in a way that succeeded. And so for an art form, or let's just say for a medium that has always been defined by that tension between being very expensive to make and therefore having to be very commercially oriented. Right? So it's a product, but also something that attracts people who want to create things and tell stories and immerse people in a dream. Those 2 things have always I've created kind of a spectrum that I always hope for something that has a little bit of both, that is as accessible and open as a George Lucas movie, my favorite director, David Lynch, does that all the time. The movies, that dreams that you can just step into and that you don't have to pass some kind of test or be educated or anything. You just have to open yourself up and walk into it. And there you are. And that's what cinema can be. I guess the other thing that distinguishes me a little bit when I look around my own media studies department, not everybody, but a lot of people tend to be within universities, a little bit, dare I say it, elitist
or more rigorous in the categorization.
Yeah, or maybe a little bit defensive about the idea like we're doing film, but we're doing it seriously, so we can only do serious. The business of cinema is also serious, and the ways in which media also have political and ideological power, that's serious. So we also need to take seriously what these movies, right, give people, not just in terms of the ideas that they give them, like in the sense that they are also often in some ways propagandistic in the values that they communicate, but also what people get out of them, right? So what are people getting out of movies like The Fast and the Furious, right? Not just, oh, they're teaching people to be misogynistic assholes, right? But what are people getting from what is giving people pleasure? And that's always a double thing. So that's what I'm interested in.
We'll almost get to Fast and the Furious, but no, this is great, and I just want to comment that for me, your book Capitalist Superheroes was very important because you teach at the University of Utrecht, and this is a book that I think perfectly captured something that I was feeling as a teenager when I was watching these movies. I remember coming out of The Dark Knight Rises and just thinking, this film is saying a lot about society, but I'm not exactly sure what, but you can just feel that it is suffused with implied meaning.
Yeah.
And I think you've taken it upon yourself, almost Don Quixotean, in the sense that you try to probe a bit deeper in what's under the hood of Hollywood, in, like you said, on the political economy level, but also on the ideological one. To take these things quite seriously. Maybe it is good to briefly, let's say, ground your research subject, and then maybe you can also explain why that took you to the Fast and the Furious franchise.
Sure. So that was my first book, the one on superhero movies that came out of my PhD dissertation. It's funny because it's like that book really is still sort of like going around. People still talk to me about it, which is really, really nice. But I look back at it almost a little bit. It's very typical for a particular kind of critical tradition that sees films as being vessels for political ideas that are almost by definition conservative, right? So it's like the movies that you think you enjoy, or maybe you are really enjoying them, but you're enjoying them while being fed conservative political propaganda.
Well, that's of course what you are famous for. I would be remiss to not mention the Lion King is actually fucking fascist.
It's a fun game to play, right? It's like a party trick. It's like take this thing that you love and now look closely at it. And it works so well because these movies were almost, we're not almost, we are conditioned to not think about them critically in that way. We think about them as an experience. We think about them as nostalgia and as a ride, right? So in the same way that we don't, come out of a roller coaster and then deconstruct the meaning of the roller coaster, we don't come out of a Disney or Marvel movie deconstructing that. We're just like, it's everybody sort of walks around with that giant let people enjoy things meme, like, no, we don't want to think about them because we also, I think we're kind of aware that if we do think about them, it'll ruin that enjoyment. And we're fond of that enjoyment, and especially with Disney movies because it starts so early, so they're really like it's a part of your childhood, and you don't want to ruin it. So that's the thing that's fun to do with with your students, and you're passing on a tradition. But that's what that book really was. It's like if you look at what the meanings are that are contained in these films, for a lot of people, they're just not easily compatible with the way they think about their actual political beliefs. So they're like, I love Christopher Nolan, but then you're like, oh yeah, do you realize that all of his movies are super fucking conservative? Like, no, I don't want to go there. So one thing that happened after that book came out and some people read it was people would ask, like, I think just a very normal question, which is, are they meant to be this way? And do people also experience them in that way? And so that led me in more recent work that I've written to be a little bit less sort of the kind of critic who is like above the material, looking down on it and finding secret meanings by sort of, following the breadcrumbs, and instead thinking about them as a much more dialectical process. So I was thinking about them more like, well, yes, these meanings are there, but it's also a little bit cherry picking to sort of pick them out. It's like you said about The Dark Knight Rises, many articles were written at the time by left-wing critics saying, it's demonizing the Occupy Wall Street movement, which it is, I mean, obviously, but it's not only doing that, right? It's doing a lot of different things. It's just kind of throwing stuff at the wall to give this sense of relevance, right? It's like this movie is about something.
It's literally how I felt. I felt like, what, this is like the film of our time. And then like you could point at a million things, but then to really see them through, it would also be kind of like ineffectual, but it just felt like the film screamed urgency.
You can say like, and so like the Joker in The Dark Knight he represents like the chaos of Al Qaeda or something, or post 9/11 terrorism. And you're like, yeah, sure, okay, I guess. But also he's like the most interesting and fun character in the movie that everybody loves and enjoys spending time with. So like, is that Al-Qaeda? It's like, no, of course not, right? He's basically so much more interesting and fun than that boring Batman. Right? So there's always much more going on in them. So I've tried in, as I've inelegantly moved into middle age, I've tried to, in my writing, to be a little bit more like, appreciative of the complexity of these kinds of big popular movies.
The big interplay, how are they being made? Why are they being made? Like undergirding political, economical framework.
Yes. And that to me in the end is, I think, a much more compelling and interesting story than the question to what extent a particular movie can be interpreted as being, conservative or progressive in its politics, whatever they are. And also the culture has just sort of taken that on as its collective hobby, as being like, this movie is not, Barbie is not being sufficiently feminist as a movie, being neoliberal feminism rather than intersectional feminism. No, it is intersectional. Look at these characters. Like, those are the debates that people are having on TikTok and on Reddit. So it's like, well, in the end, it's like, it doesn't actually matter so much. I mean, it does matter, but it doesn't matter that much whether these movies are 100% progressive or 100% conservative, if the value they are creating is actual financial value for giant corporations that own literally everything, right? So the way in which film production has shifted to be a smaller component in a larger content production industry is ultimately more interesting, I think, more interesting as if you're interested in thinking about, about media power than looking too closely at the details of representational politics in any given Hollywood movie.
And this is why Fast and the Furious, to me, when you announced that you wrote this book, was so interesting to me, because like in the rear view mirror, to stay in the car analogy, it makes so much sense, because here we have what started as a simple, like, speed obsessed, somewhat between an action film and a crime caper, is somewhat, let's say, naive, almost mid-budget Hollywood film. Let's say, I think, solidified the career of Vin Diesel and Paul Walker, many other actors. And then suddenly you find yourself like keeping up with these films. Also, in my case, being somewhat baffled by its trajectory, because suddenly there's a scene where Ludacris is in space, and all of these people have turned into these kind of like superhero entities almost.
And they're meanwhile making jokes about this happening,
like,
right?
I don't believe that
It's
we're
like,
in space.
This can't be. How can a car be in space?
Exactly.
This is insane.
The classic Marvel, Joss Whedon style thing. Oh, did you see that just happen? But this trajectory now, of course, serves in your book as a very strong analogy for a trajectory that a lot of people either subconsciously have felt or have very critically already spotted, which is, what the fuck has happened with mainstream cinema?
When did it become the content slop factory? It's
like this huge CGI spectacle bloat that we're supposed to watch and enjoy, but actually only maybe to justify the $300 million+ investment that is being put in by, like you said, not necessarily a studio, but a conglomerate. So you have a very, let's say, thankful and very productive franchise. I now describe the franchise maybe very badly. Maybe I would like to invite you to briefly explain what the hell is Fast and Furious to the aliens out there that don't know it, but also what took your interest in it as the subject of a book.
No, but I think that's more necessary than it might be with other less disreputable franchises, because it's so funny, over the past, I don't know, year and a half, a little bit longer since I've worked on the book. Every time it came up, I've always been a little bit apologetic, or certainly defensive. Not really defensive, more apologetic than defensive. It's about the Fast and the Furious, but it's really about media franchising. This is just a convenient example, right? Because I guess there's a sense that you can't talk seriously about these movies, and I also never assume that another person has seen literally any of them, but I always assume that people know the term and have probably negative associations with it.
I mean, just as a very brief aside, in this era of Too Fast, Too Furious, the sequel to Fast and Furious, that became like its own Reddit joke forever.
Yes, for sure. That is ultimately more a class thing than anything else, I would say, right? That we can list the Fast and the Furious among the biggest, most profitable movie franchises in history, but among all of them, it is the most explicitly lowbrow.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like the working man's franchise rather than like the sort of nerdy franchise
It's
or
very blue collar. Or
very much, very much. So to just very briefly clarify its history or its existence. So it's, as you said, it started out like the first movie was just made as a summer action movie that was already, when it came out, sort of criticized for plagiarizing the movie Point Break, which was about half a decade previous. So it uses the same basic story formula. An undercover cop infiltrates a petty crime gang led by a charismatic guy, and they have their bromance thing going on. And ultimately, they like band together, but not quite. And so it was just unexpectedly successful, facing off against much bigger blockbusters in the box office. And so it was greenlit for a sequel right away, the infamous Too Fast, Too Furious, which, the title is so fantastic because it just simply it just announces its own mercenary quality.
Yes, exactly.
Right? It's so cheesy and it's so like beyond belief in being like a low rent sequel title that it was the perfect example of how we think like the worst example of a Hollywood sequel, right? That has no redeeming quality, just to do the same thing but louder. Yes. Right? Which is not doing justice to Too Fast, Too Furious.
I love Too Fast, Too Furious.
And so you get a third movie, which is even further down the food chain, right? Tokyo Drift.
Yeah, which I also love.
But which is like, okay, we've done the same thing twice with diminishing results.
Yeah.
And now we're going to do it again, but for reasons, too complicated to even go into, we'll have it set in Japan and as a high school drama rather than as like about the illegal subcultures of Los Angeles street racing.
So just to jump in, when you say diminishing returns, you're not speaking financially.
Yeah, I am speaking.
Really?
Oh yes, I'm speaking both in the critical perception of the films and financially. So the classic pattern for blockbuster sequels from Jaws onward. So the blockbuster, like the post-classical age of Hollywood of the blockbuster age begins in 1975. And so you get movies that are so big that they get big sequels. But the sequels cost more and make less.
Yeah.
And so after, you can only do a few of them because it tarnishes the brand to have these endless. It's like the joke in Back to the Future Part 2, right?
Yes.
It's like you can do 2 or 3, but you can't do Jaws 18, right? Because it becomes stupid. It's already stupid very quickly. And there are many movies like Superman 4 that were like the nail in the coffin. Like, it's like, okay, we got to stop Batman and Robin. There's many of these examples of big franchises that you do 2 or 3. The only place where you could do more than that was like in small horror things that also became their own kind of joke, right? So you have these proliferating horror sequels that are only sort of feeding into this idea that you cannot do many sequels because it becomes a joke. That's why I thought Fast and Furious again was such a great example to talk about that change, because the first movies are following that same logic. They're making less money with each new movie, and they would have ended after the third one or gone to like direct to video, or things like that, if it hadn't been for the fact that in the early 2000s, things were starting to change, because you were getting things like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, which were showing that you can have like you can have something other than diminishing results. So you can use DVD sales to actually prep the audience for the new one and no longer be too worried about the fact that like every blockbuster has to stand completely on its own, right? Like Batman Returns is like its own complete movie, completely separate from Batman, and Batman 3 again, right? And so the second cycle in the Fast and Furious history is another 3 movies that start doing that start saying, this is not a blockbuster sequel anymore. This is an ongoing serialized story about a group of people that we've now made into like on a TV show, like a sitcom, and we're going to grow it, and we're going to have cliffhanger endings and stuff like that. And then from number 4 on, like the money they're making goes through the roof. Like the 4th movie makes almost twice the amount the first movie has. And so it then becomes like with the 6th movie, it becomes like part of the pantheon of like mega blockbusters, making more than $1 billion for a movie. And it becomes an outlier. So it's paving the way for what is now the dominant logic, which is not like a big hit. We're not trying to find a formula that will be a big blockbuster movie. And then if it's appropriate and it's also feasible, we'll do like 1 or 2 sequels. But you can't pitch a movie to a Hollywood studio as a movie anymore. It has to be the beginning of some kind of cinematic universe. And it really can't be an original beginning anymore either, right? It's like you have to be Ryan Coogler or Christopher Nolan or Quentin Tarantino to even pitch this idea like I have an original screenplay and it's just this movie.
Yeah, and give me at least $200 million.
And give me the money to have movie stars and big production value and massive distribution. So Fast and Furious did that, and then also kind of peaked along with the rest of the industry just before COVID in 2018, right? With like Marvel's Endgame. And
Yeah.
it's like, it's so funny. It's like everything sort of came to this.
It was such a, like, I remember it like it was like a hallucinatory experience to see all of these like big franchises being set up, and then they within the same year almost have the culmination of all of these films.
Yeah.
And then in the book, of course, then afterwards comes the decline.
Yes.
So like then you have the COVID era, and nothing really hits the same anymore.
No.
And I remember, like, I at some point just aside with these Marvel films, that I was completely checked out of them at some point.
Yeah.
But that with a friend of mine, that she and I were like, we gotta go see Endgame just so that we can feel what the audience is feeling, just to have a sense, right? Because
Yeah,
it's like such an event.
Yeah.
I thought it was fucking dog shit, but it was interesting to be in the room and just to spectate it. So with this franchise, you have like very conveniently laid out basically the map of contemporary Hollywood, like in its more naive blockbuster mode at the beginning of the 21st century.
Yes.
To where we are now, a time in which it's much more easy to be cynical to some degree. Why these films are being made, how they're being made, in what context they sit within the framework of a mega corporation.
Well, first, let me say, I wouldn't say we've gone from the naive blockbuster to a more cynical point of view, though maybe like you're a younger generation than me. I would say we've gone from one kind of cynicism to a more profound degree of cynicism.
That's a very important nuance.
Because when the blockbuster together with video, I recently reread this wonderful book called Cinema Without Walls by Timothy Corrigan. It's written in the early 90s. It's about Hollywood after Vietnam, basically, and sort of about how the combination of home video and the blockbuster became the ways in which film and just cinema as an experience was no longer really about film, but was about a distracted mode of viewing, right? Where you're either basically on a roller coaster ride in a movie theater to experience a blockbuster, or you're at home just consuming films, but never with your full attention, which it was eerie reading that book now, because you're just like, dude, that is exact, like there is no other way to watch Netflix than in a distracted mode. The whole interface is about overloading you, and every result is just a provisional, every choice is a provisional choice. I'll watch a little bit of this. No, it's not quite what I was in the mood. I'll shift it anyway. Now we've entered this weird limbo phase where the plan that had seemed for a moment, this isn't it always the case with capitalism, there was like, we have a plan and it's working. Oh shit, it's now not working anymore. What now? But there's no plan B, right? There's no like, oh, maybe we should go back into like the actual film business and start investing in like making the kinds of films that audiences do clearly want to see. Like if you look to the two big Oscar contenders from this past year, Sinners and One Battle After Another, which I think are both great examples of the kind of thing that American cinema can do, where the international cinema, can do really, really well, right? Make really big movies that play well for a full audience in a big movie theater, and that give you some things to like think about, that aren't being didactic. It's not like, this is what you should think about activism, or this is what you should think about racism, besides the fact that it's bad. It's like, wait, what was are the vampires whiteness? No, that can't be right. You're just sort of, they give you something to think about, but they also give you just a fun evening in the movies, and you come out feeling heightened, It's perfect. It's winning for everybody, and they're financially successful. But these are rarities, right?
Yeah.
They're no longer the kind of thing that Hollywood routinely makes or that any national cinema industry makes. And the reason for it is not that there aren't talented filmmakers or there isn't enough money going around or that people don't want them. The reason is that the things that we think of as film studios that still have those logos are no longer really movie studios. They haven't been for a long time, but for a while they were still able to operate as such. It meaning that they were businesses that made money from trying to anticipate what kinds of movies would be successful in a given moment. And gifted filmmakers and producers, people like Jerry Bruckheimer, Steven Spielberg, had this kind of weird antenna where they're like, this is the vibe and the politics of the culture. And this is the kind of thing that could really resonate right now. And were right more often than they were wrong. So it was about giving filmmakers opportunities to connect with big audiences. And the people in charge of the studios, they were like trying to, find a way to balance all of that they were making more hits than they were misses. But now we're in a situation where those companies are now very small parts of these big conglomerates that are not only competing with each other, but they're also competing with themselves.
Literally,
right?
yes.
So we have all of these different departments, and one department is in charge of amusement parks, and one of them is in charge of cruises, and one of them is in charge of streaming services. Like you read this increasingly often, is how like we think of the film as being the product. For us, as movie guys, it's like the thing that it's all about. It's the most satisfying thing. But for the stockholders, because they're the ones whose quarterly profits are at stake, for them it is literally content. It's just a derivative, right? It's something to speculate about. It's like which studio, and like, they had CinemaCon just last week, and all the big studios gave previews for the next 2 years of their upcoming stuff. We finally have a date for the Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse movie, etc.
Yes.
Right? But they're all franchise movies. They're all things. They're Incredibles 3, the live action remake of Moana, right? And the reason that they're making these predictable garbage, just the same movie over and over again, is because firstly, the risk of making the same movie again and again because it's well known to audiences is less than making something that's less. And this has always been the case, but it's the financial stakes are now different, and that means that it tilts in a particular direction. And the other thing is that these investors in these companies, they like to see money coming in more regularly than you can with films, right? A film is only going to be around to make money for a short amount of time, and it has to make its money, a large part of its money, in the first couple of weeks. So there's a lot at stake there. And so it's risky. Whatever it is, even Indiana Jones, is risky. It's not risky to sell baseball caps with the Incredibles logo on it, right? Because you can do that all year long, right? And so if you start thinking of a film, and this is terribly depressing, but as just like an advertisement for a brand that is not really material, whether any given Fast and Furious movie or any given Marvel movie
like
makes a lot of money.
Advertorial campaign, basically, more than anything.
They're making money by having kids wanting to go to Disneyland or the Universal parks or go on a cruise or something like that, or get a pencil case that has a particular character or logo on it. Because those are the things that keep money coming in week after week after week. And film does play a role in that whole dynamic because it tells stories that connect emotionally to people, and people won't want to buy a Snow White dress for their kids unless they think that Snow White as a character is meaningful to their child, or an Ariel, whatever, or a Dom singlet. Who knows? That has become, I would say, their primary function. Right, so that's not for us, not for you and me, but that's economically become their primary function.
I love in the book then how what basically you are now describing, right, is the process of what we call financialization.
Yes.
It's the transition from one kind of capitalism to this like wildly conglomeraterized neoliberalism in, like you say, in which like one thing serves as the basis of all of these other speculative investments that these big superstructure companies make. What I very much love about the book is how succinctly you capture this, like, let's say, entire economical layer, this entire vibe around it as well, but then find a way to do close readings of the films itself
Yeah.
as well, and to kind of like interplay between these things, right?
Yeah.
For instance, there's a concept in the book which I find incredibly productive and interesting, which is a franchise time.
Oh yeah,
For
it's
instance.
Jerry Canavan's concept. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. But yeah,
But how
yeah,
to
yeah,
apply it
yeah.
to this franchise
Yeah.
is very strong. But maybe before we dive into specific terms, once you have laid out, let's say, the map of where we are now in this global capitalistic system,
Yeah.
how does that bagage then sit with you when you are dealing with the films and writing about them? I'm just very curious about, let's say, the intellectual and creative choices that you make to find the right interplay between these two things. To stick with the films,
Yeah.
but then to also have the superstructure always floating around it.
Yeah. A great political economist, the German Christian Fuchs, once said, in order to do media studies right, you have to have a balance between political economy and cultural theory. I think he calls it ideology critique. So you have to be able to do both things. You have to see the economic structures that are about production, distribution, and consumption, right? So how are these things, whose needs do they serve, right? At a kind of higher economic level. But you also have to take into account what are these things doing with and to people, right? How are people actually responding to them? And how do they create the sense that these are meaningful to us? Because it's too easy when you're doing political economy to slip into this kind of like conspiracy theory mode where it's just like a small room full of like evil white guys, like the Christmas
Very quickly gets anti-Semitic as well.
and they're just like conspiring to dupe everybody into seeing their awful movies. I mean, I've seen every one of these movies at least 5 times, and not just because I was writing a book about them. I mean, I'm sure I'd seen certainly some of them more than 4 times before I even considered writing this. Every single time was a conscious choice to like, I want to watch Fast Five tonight,
Yeah.
and not feeling duped by it, but getting my money's, like getting the thing that I wanted out of the movie.
Yeah,
Whatever
you gave it your
ridiculous-
time and it gave you a
Yes.
fun evening in return.
Yeah, it did. And so you gotta, and I think it's also a little bit condescending to just simply assume that these movies only exist to take people's money and ideas away from them.
Because you can see, and this is also why I like these films, that like there's so many scenes are actually very creative. The cast at some point, like I said, they become canonized almost, like
Yeah.
almost icons
Yeah.
to some degree of like working class icons almost.
Yeah.
You see them having fun, like, and I always just love when I see talented, hot people in films having fun. I'm like, that's dope. To see Ludacris and Michelle Rodriguez and Riff or whatnot, this is fantastic, right?
It's great, and it's like this movie is not trying to be, it's not trying to be something that's super smart in the way that we think, art house film is supposed to be really clever in a really smart way. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think, au contraire, I think there's a lot that's great about that. It's great to have those kinds of movies. I think it's easy to misunderstand the idea, like, I'm often on my soapbox saying it's not good to have just blockbuster movies in cinemas all the time on like 100 different screens. I wanted to go see a movie the other week and I just wanted to go see some, like big movie.
Yeah, some nice slot.
But the problem was that so many of the screening times had all been taken up by the Mario Galaxy Riders movie.
Yeah.
And like literally it started every 35 minutes, another screening started on 5 or 6 different screens of this megaplex. I mean, imagine that, it's like, it's like even when there was a viral image when Black Panther came out, that there were cinemas where it was playing on literally every screen and they were all sold out. And people were celebrating that because they were like, that's a win for anti-racism or something, which I'm not sure if that's the kind of anti-racist world that we want, where all of the money is flowing to Disney for pushing out every opportunity that actual like filmmakers would have to also just simply be present and to have something other than big franchise movies. So it's not a question of saying like franchise movies are bad or blockbuster movies are bad and we shouldn't have them. I love blockbusters, but they should exist alongside a wider variety of other different kinds of movies that currently have a much smaller chance to even exist. So the issue is really was for me, like, I want to be fair to these films and also express my own enthusiasm for a lot of different aspects of these films without getting carried away. I wanted to look at things like, for instance, how the films were initially certainly ahead of the curve in their multi-ethnic casts and the multiculturalism, and to some extent their gender politics, but also to be like at the same time, by the same token, to be also very clear about how it's also not really enough. And it also got sort of, I think it got bypassed, it didn't stay ahead of the curve. It just sort of slowed down quite a bit.
And it, of course, got slightly overridden by what you describe in the book as patromasculinity, which I find a very nice concept as well. But this kind of like super heightened, kind of also valorized form of masculinity. And then that feeds also into one of the key, I think, aspects of these films that we didn't really touch upon, but seems to be the binding agent.
Yeah.
Also quite literally how the success of the films was internationally, which is the notion of the family.
I don't have friends. I got family.
These cast of characters are like they're a self-joined, like a self-created family, and these ideas of loyalty and honor amongst your family members and how to cultivate it, and how this like very singular message gets sent out, which you describe in the book very ironically is then also a reason that this film did incredibly well in China. It adheres to a certain, let's say, more traditional top-down notion of family and tradition and passing along of certain rights.
Yeah. I think there's a kind of ethics involved that has a sincerity that at that time certainly meshed really well with Chinese audiences, because it was familiar from, like the kind of more sentimentalist nationalist cinema, national action cinema that was around at the time. To return to your question about how do you sort of situate your own critical perspective around this, we're throwing in a lot of like different theoretical words, but I also tried to be, I think part of my approach to writing the book was I want it to be appropriate to its topic, in the sense that I wanted to move fast, right? So I wanted it to be a book that was like, I don't want to get bogged down in a lot of elaborate discussions of ideas that I think a lot of readers will get if you just touch on them. So I was just rereading parts of it on the train and thinking, man, I think maybe I should have stopped and spent 2 more pages talking about, petromasculinity or the ideology of speed or politics of gender. But then like 2 pages down, are like, no, fuck it. It's like
I like it.
If you're into it, like there's footnotes and you can find other sources and read up on it. But for me, I wanted the book to really sort of move and to be like a little bit of a juggling act where you're like, okay, we can move back and forth between these registers and hopefully they will benefit from each other. So you're sort of looking at how things are playing out in specific scenes, how those scenes connect to structures of meaning that are always situated in a particular historical context. So this is how it relates to what was going on at the time. And that together is a kind of an era. That's a larger era in which things are taking this particular shape, so that you can see it as a larger history, but you're looking at it, you're sort of moving back between those different levels in a way that felt like it would make sense. That's always my biggest fear, especially coming from an academic background. It's like so much academic writing to me just feels like it's belaboring a point that I feel tired of. I'm like, yeah, I get it already. Can we just move on? I suppose when you're working on a film when you're doing analysis of a film that is very dense with meaning, maybe it takes, maybe it can be more rewarding to unpack some of that in more detail. But I think the kinds of movies that I generally like to write about, they aren't really dense in that way.
No.
Right? They're not meant to be unpacked, to be sort of studied and pored over, like what are the many meanings and metaphors packed into, the moment when Dom jumps off of his car and rescues, in midair on this bridge in Spain. It's like, holy shit, really do that,
That's the meaning, yes.
But it's worth pondering that moment in terms of, okay, how is this sort of reimagining what kind of hero Dom can be? What are the limits of his humanity at this time? how does that relate to changing production practices as well? It's like, we're now in a stage where these movies are judged not just by, what kind of story they tell or whether they have, as the makers keep repeating, fast cars and hot chicks in them, but that they have to have these sort of load-bearing action moments that are, it's like after they dangle Tom Cruise from the Burj Khalifa, it's like, oh, what are we going to do with our stars, and how are we going to make that look cool?
Like this impenetrable drill tank thing that drives through the desert and just destroying everything in its way, and they need to find a way to go in one of the films. And it's just one of those scenes that I was also in the cinema because I was also just like, and why the fuck not go?
How about a tank driving across like a frozen lake, and then the giant submarine comes bursting through the lake to toss the cars around like toys, It's like the 10-year-old children around a table and saying, and then this happens, and then that happens. But now, can we find a filmmaker who's able to stage an action sequence in a way that feels spatially coherent,
and that has the physical weight to
so
justify
it doesn't feel like it's just another screensaver, And then it's so cool to see in this whole series of films, there are filmmakers who sort of step up and bring something to the table, like John Singleton in Too Fast, Too Furious. He really, in his audio commentary, he says, I really like, it's like a for-hire job, and I would rather be making small independent films about the Black experience, but I made a few and they weren't making any money, so I took this job, and then I just tried to put my stink on it, is what he says, I love that phrase. He's like, I just try to do little things that make the film stand out, and that also give little accents to things that make it a little bit more like my own. And some filmmakers do it and some don't, some are just like, no, I'm just here, I'm just here to do a job. Louis Leterrier is like the ultimate hack, he's just like, I'll just do the thing in the way that most people would imagine this happening.
Path of least resistance.
Yeah, exactly. And then you get a film that doesn't really feel like a film. It feels like an effects reel, with some coverage connecting the different scenes, and with no consistency in tone. So I'd say, like, within the franchise, and this is another thing that I do kind of like about it, you get a wild variety of different kinds, different levels of success, artistic success, craftsmanship, a number of different kinds of styles, and it's all sort of precariously made coherent by this sort of retroactive insistence that it was all meant to build up.
Yeah, it's like a theological worldview of history. It's like it all had to end up here because all of the things that happened before.
It's like people watching one of the Avengers Endgame movies and say, oh man, they had this whole thing planned out. It's like, no, they did not. They just were smart enough to make these movies, each of which was made sort of, well, if it's successful, we'll make another one. But we'll just put a few little things in there in the background that potentially we can pick up later, and then we can make it seem like it was meant to be a story.
Dan, let's end on a small note and on a big note. Let's start with the small one, which is, after having studied these films again, written about them, is there a distinct moment that you can recall in any of the films that just that is very fond to you? Just a scene, a moment, a vibe, a thing that you connected with?
For me, the moment was when Furious 7 came out, right? And by that time I was fully on board. I was ride or die with the franchise. I was like, I know this is not cool, and this is like, I don't know, lowbrow stuff, but these movies are nailing it. Like Fast 5, I love. Fast and Furious 6, I thought was really great.
It's fantastic. Yes.
And then 7 came out, and there's a moment really early in the film where, like, Paul Walker's character has a kid now, right? So there's a new meaning to family, and he has this little toy car, and he tells him, like, hey, cars don't fly. And like, oh my God, okay.
Yeah,
so they're gonna make cars fly in this movie, and it's a setup. And I think it's a good game of setting things up and then paying them off. Yeah. And I think at that point, Justin Lin had been doing the movies, has been the director from Tokyo Drift on up to the 7th film.
Yeah.
And he and the cast, they found this formula that worked for those 4 movies, and they just did it again and again. They were like, okay, we now know what we're doing. We're craftspeople doing this stuff, And it's just telling the audience this is gonna happen. It's a tiny moment, but it's a moment that shows how well the movies know what they're doing and understand its relationship with the audience and telling them, okay,
It's like pre-programming pleasure almost. Right? It's
yes,
like you're in the car with your parents when you're young, and they announce that you're going to McDonald's.
it's
like,
exactly that.
yeah.
And that too is all about trust.
Yeah.
It's like, you're going to get that thing, you know, it's not going to be like a special, exceptional thing. It's going to be the thing that you know what it's going to be like. It's going to be that ice cream cone, you know, it's going to taste really good, and we're going to make sure it comes in, and we're going to deliver, and you know they're going to deliver, and they do.
Yeah.
We would have looked back much more fondly, I think, and be much more defensive of the franchise as a whole if it had ended right there after the seventh film. It was like, okay, they did it. Boom, it's over. Marvel, same thing.
Yes.
Endgame, and
Yes.
over.
It's
Bye-bye.
over.
That's the last
Yes.
Marvel movie. We will not return.
Well, and that is literally a perfect setup, almost like we are setting it up to the big question, which is that, you know, we're at the end, and very briefly I mentioned that in the book you identify all of these faces.
Yeah.
You already mentioned that very often in the capitalist world, people think they have the success formula, it goes awry, and they need to find something else. Now we are in the post-COVID era of what you could call decline, where both the trust has ceased to exist to some degree from the audience as well. The critical appreciation is less so. The stakes have never been higher for these films to actually succeed, because they have to be incredibly costly to justify very often even being produced.
Yeah.
You can name a countless reasons to be skeptical of the state of commercial cinema, especially from America. But coming at this end stage and covering the decline of the franchise in tandem with Hollywood, on what level of reflection are you on where we are now and where we are going with this industry?
That's a great one. I mean, one of the recent movies that was in that kind of vein that I enjoyed seeing, just buying a ticket and going to see it, was Project Hail Mary, which I thought was so interesting because it was a very pleasurable movie-going experience for myself and the friend that I went with, and like a sold-out crowd that was obviously having a great time. But it was an important film for the industry because it's an Amazon MGM film. And so we have this streaming company that still has like half a foot in the movie going business, wanting to show that it can do like a blockbuster, you know, an original blockbuster.
But by the way, one aside, that very often in Cannes or in Venice, if the festivals even allow an Amazon production to be screened in like the competition of the festival, and you're in the press screening and you're with 1,000 journalists and the Amazon logo comes on, people always start howling and screaming. The same with the Netflix logo. It's just this like immediate antagonized vibe towards it, right? Yeah. And just remembering that it always gives a physical reaction because it feels scary.
Yeah, it does. I think that's the perfectly accurate response because it represents a much deeper threat than I think most people even realize, right? Because it's not just the Apple logo or the Amazon or the Netflix logo coming into cinema theaters. It's that logo telling you the future of cinema belongs to us, not you.
Yeah.
And we're going to define what's going to happen, right? What we're just seeing, and this is not speculation, this is just the facts that we're observing right now. Fewer films are being made. Fewer people are going to see the big films that are being made. The bigger films that are being made are having tremendous trouble justifying the expense in terms of what it costs to put them into cinemas. And the people who are really in the crunch there, stuck in it, those are the people managing the cinemas, because they just need to make money from popcorn sales, mostly, because they don't make hardly any money from ticket sales. So they're the ones suffering, and they're the ones being pushed out. I want, like, a reader coming out of the book, the chapter ends like, sort of like, well, there is no plan B. These franchises now are too big to fill. We are going to see more Fast and Furious movies in whatever form, whether or not it takes a hiatus now that the Vin Diesel, you know, owned Fast and Furious version. It's like right now, just for people who aren't following this, like Fast and Furious is like, it ended with the Fast X, which is not owned by Elon Musk, weirdly, but it was supposed to be the Infinity War movie of the Fast and Furious franchise, but it was crazy expensive. It wasn't a very good movie. People didn't really enjoy it very much. It was successful, but not by far successful enough to justify its existence in the way that it wanted to be. And so since then, because Vin Diesel is co-producer, he owns a lot of the Fast and Furious franchise, it's stuck between him and Universal because they don't trust him with it anymore, and the direction that he's taking. And he hasn't been able to find a way to keep himself the star of this thing and move it into a profitable franchise future for Universal. So they're waiting him out right now. At some point, he'll give up. You're like, okay, guys, obviously I'm not Dom in the Fast and Furious anymore. That story's never going to end completely. Somebody will write a comic book, the ending Dom story. But they're going to have other actors and a new next generation cast because the brand can be profitable and there's going to be people with nostalgia for it. The thing that I think is on my mind, having just reread the book, and that I think people may think about after reading it, is the future of cinema going is one where either we're going to see things like Amazon and Netflix owned cinemas, right, in major cities, where you will see their content for a limited time, for premium prices. And you will still see, because they are fortunately doing very well, small independent art house type places, also mostly in the major cities, that are now doing very well in many countries, certainly in the Netherlands, much less so in the United States, but with boutique programming that is much more focused than it was before, not just on new films, but on special, like on lectures, on series, on director retrospectives, and on like revisiting classics, stuff like
Literally the cinema we're in right now.
Exactly. And they have a great audience because having film be a social experience and to do it together, like, that's just a lot of fun. It's very meaningful and fun for a lot of people. And that's not a thing that you get out of streaming at all. But the thing that we are slowly losing right now is film as like this sort of democratic populist thing where you go to the movies, and you go to and there's a bunch of different posters, and you go like, there's a movie with this movie star, there's a Ryan Gosling movie, there's a Margot Robbie movie, Oh, they're playing Jaws again, sure, why not? We'll just look at them. There's a courtroom drama, there's a romantic comedy, it's like something for everybody a little bit.
Just
they're inoffensive and they're working
great mid-brow, mid-budget fare is like the most I think yearned for type of.
I think so. And they're not making them anymore. And that's the thing that would having not low budget, medium budget genre films, right, is a thing that people are rediscovering now on some streaming platforms and some boutique DVD labels and stuff. But it's not the thing that Hollywood does anymore. And in that sense, the future belongs to whatever streamers decide they want to do with it to suit their own whims. Like if you had like a David Ellison saying, I want to be in charge of a studio making big movies like this, and I will buy a bunch of theaters and show them in it, he can do it because they have money to burn anyway. But it's no longer a question of what kind of movies will be profitable and that will drive the business. And that's where I think the biggest concern is. It's the same problem with big tech. It's like there are overlords who own these things, and whatever direction it takes is not up to us, it's up to them. And however much money we spend on any of these movies is going to be immaterial anyway.
The ultimate question is how much gas Hollywood still has left in the tank to sustain this culture that they had initially promised us.
I think that's 100% right. And while I think one of the lines from the movie is, if you live your life 1/4 mile at a time, but those are financial quarters right now, right? It's the stockholders' financial quarters that we're thinking about, and those are the miles that we're making right now. So those are the ones.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for this lovely chat. I assume you're gonna go on a grand tour with the book.
A small tour, but yes, it is a little bit of a tour.
Well, I wish you so much fun, and I can't wait for our next chat, and hopefully to have you back on. I think you're a good match for celebrating.
It's such a pleasure to be here.
It's fun,
That's it for this episode of Celebrating Cinema's Sign of the Times and the Fast and the Furious franchise. Thanks so much for listening. We can't wait to see you on June 17th. You can, of course, get your tickets through the link in the show notes. Subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast. And if you have a minute or two, it really helps us if you leave a review. Also, keep sending us your film hot takes and confessions on Instagram in a voice note, or send your voice note to celebratingcinema@lab111.nl. Join us next week when Elliot and I will discuss Steven Spielberg's new release Disclosure Day, which I'm really excited about, and the meaning of space and alien in films. Why do we go there? Join us next week when Elliot and I will discuss Steven Spielberg's new release, Disclosure Day. I'm really excited. And we're going to talk about the meaning of space and aliens in film. Stay connected with us at Celebrating Cinema and Lab by following at Lab111 on Instagram and Letterboxd. This was a Lab 111 production, edited and produced by Elliot Bloom, and co-produced by myself, Laura Gomans. Music comes from Hugo Emmerzael, and the artwork is by Studio FFF.